We are very excited today to have a number of guests, which is part of why we have a lot to get through. And thanks everyone for answering our question about connecting to the natural world. So as you know, today we're going to be talking about some local environmental organizations and how environmental movements and race are confronting the challenges of today to create a just and sustainable future tomorrow. So we'll introduce our guest that you see on this slide in just a moment. But for now, we just wanted to give you some overall background on CORE, for those of you who have not been part of these chats or other CORE events. So CORE stands for the Collective of Results and Evidence-Based Investments. And it's a funding model, but also broader than that, a movement to achieve equitable health and well-being in our county using a results-based collective impact approach. We can share lots more materials about this, but we just wanted to offer this as the framework for the conversations we're trying to have every week about different aspects of what we're calling core conditions in our community. We've worked with a lot of different partners, some of you on the call, steering committee guidance from members like Greg Pepping, who's one of our guests today. We have been trying to articulate a mission and vision that put equity at the center. And you can see them here, I won't read them to you, but all of these have in common, these statements about CORE have in common the idea of how we can inspire action to achieve equitable health and well-being for everyone in our county across the lifespan and every part of the county. So when we say equitable health and well-being, what we mean is that everyone has an equitable opportunity to experience these 8 core conditions for health and well-being, and that means that they can achieve these regardless of their age, race or ethnicity, sexual orientation, where they live, and any aspect of their life and where they live would not determine these health outcomes for better or for worse. So that's what equitable health and well-being, or opportunities for equitable health and well-being, means to us. So just to explain how we see some of the connections across these and how this might apply to today's coffee chat topic. Some of you may have seen the news yesterday that the Arctic Circle reported its first ever temperature over 100 degrees, which is very far from ideal. But we don't have to travel to the Arctic Circle to know how climate change is affecting us here. We've already experienced the environmental effects of climate change with extreme heat days closer to home. And those create less predictable growing seasons, for example, for our ag sector. And those high temperatures in turn can make agricultural workers in the fields very sick if they try to continue working. They can experience things like dehydration or fainting or worse. When they're paid by the amount that they pick instead of an hourly livable wage, then their economic situation, which is already tenuous, can become even more unpredictable. Unpredictable schedules can make it harder to stay in school, and those shifting work schedules and pay can affect family stability, access to childcare, and those kinds of dimensions as well. And if ag workers have to take on extra shifts or jobs to make up for the shortfalls in their pay, they have fewer opportunities to participate in civic life. Employers also might shift to making workers pick at night to avoid the heat, and that creates its own health and safety risks, like the risk of sexual assault or disrupted sleep patterns. And substandard crowded housing can have its own effects on health and safety. So these are just some examples that are drawn actually from Regeneración's recent report on how a changing climate is affecting farm workers in the Pájaro Valley. We'll share that report and others with you in a follow-up email, but thanks to Rachel for sharing it with us, and to Nancy and Natalie for being with us today. The flip side of everything we've just described and all the connections across these is that in addition to having adverse effects on health and well-being, the flip side is to have positive effects on health and well-being from the connections around all of these. So today's topic, as we mentioned, is the race dimensions of local environmental movements. And that's also why we want to emphasize that all of these core conditions and the connections across them flow through equity at the center. So we will talk more about that as we go along with our talk today. But this chat today is part of a series of core coffee chats. Many of you have been with us weekly most of the time, or even some of you all of the time. We should have a special award for people who've been to every weekly coffee chat. But they're designed to build knowledge and inspire collective action among all of us: funders, policymakers, service providers, advocates, community members. We're calling the umbrella for all of these chats the Core Institute for Innovation and Impact. And we hope to continue offering different kinds of capacity building and knowledge sharing and inspirational talks just to share what's going on in our community. Some of the talks have been really skill-based or focusing on practical tools like how to use Zoom at the beginning, how to use DataShare, a local resource and data platform. And others are more about the impacts and responses to COVID-19, or topics like today's on racial equity within the environmental movement. So we hope to continue offering these. At the end of today's chat, we'll let you know about some of the upcoming topics and hope that you'll join us for those as well. But for now, I'll just turn things over to Nicole Young, who will introduce our guests, who you'll hear more from throughout the chat today. Go ahead,
Great,
Nicole.
thank you. And as I say your name for our guests, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and unmute yourselves really quickly and just say hi to the camera so that your face appears and people know who you are if they don't already. So I just want to say a warm welcome and a huge thank you to all of our guests that are joining us today as speakers. They, some of them are actually ones that reached out to suggest this topic first to us. And then as we started kind of thinking through what would we want to focus on today and what could we realistically cover in an hour and do it justice, all of our speakers really just jumped right in with us to help shape the agenda and share ideas. And so we're really excited about what they all have to share and talk to us about today. And so our guests are Ileana Ortega Brunetti from Watsonville Wetlands Watch. That's one of the roles that she has, and she's the Development and Community Outreach Director for Watsonville Wetlands Watch. Ileana, you want to unmute yourself really quickly and say hi?
Good morning, everyone. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thanks. And then we have Katherine O'Day, who's the Executive Director of Save Our Shores. Katherine, you want to unmute yourself and say a quick hi?
Yes, good morning, everyone. So glad you could join us this morning, and I hope we make an interesting conversation for you today.
Thank you. And then next we have Rachel Kippen, who's the Executive Director of O'Neill Sea Odyssey. Rachel, you want to say hi?
Hi, good morning.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And Greg Pepping, who's the Executive Director of the Coastal Watershed Council and also a member of the Core Steering Committee.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Good to be with you.
Thanks, Greg. And we're also so fortunate to have Nancy Faulstich, who's the Executive Director, and Natalie Olivas, who's a community organizer, and both are representing Regeneración, Pájaro Valley Climate Action. So thank you so much for all of you for being here. And we'll just tell everyone that we have a number of questions that we're going to pose to our guest speakers, and they will share their thoughts in response to those with us. We encourage all of you to also ask your questions in the chat box. We know that we might not be able to get to all of them today, and so if there are things that are burning questions that we don't get to, we'll ask our guest speakers to help us generate responses to those so we can send that as part of the follow-up. And as Nicole Lezin mentioned, we are recording this. We send out the link to the YouTube recording within a couple days after each coffee chat. And so why don't we go ahead and get started, because we have some big questions for our guest speakers. And so Nicole Lezin's going to ask the first one.
Okay, now I'm going to pose this one to Rachel. Why does racial equity matter in environmental movements?
All right, thank you for asking this question. So I think just, based on the example that you gave, we can all see how equity and all of the lines of equity matter in environmental movements, that in the environment intersects with everything, right? And I think as a movement, we haven't necessarily done the best job of reminding folks that our public health is entirely dependent upon a healthy environment. And one of the things that I wanted to briefly share with you folks this morning was when we were having this discussion around, how do we frame this conversation? We were thinking about the lens that we wanted to look at it through. So if we're going to talk about environmental justice and we're going to talk about doing all of this work as an environmental sector, how are we doing this internal work of being reflective and representative of our communities? And one of the things that I really appreciate about Nancy Faulstich is that she's kind of retrained me to say, instead of saying people of color, to say the people of the global majority. And so if we're not including the people of the global majority, how do we expect to be even remotely effective at this work? So with that, if you wouldn't mind doing our first slide. I wanted to introduce you to one of the scholars that I studied during graduate school. I got a degree in environmental justice education, and we were introduced to Dr. Dorcetta Taylor. She is the first Black woman to receive a PhD from Yale's environmental studies program. And she authored this kind of shocking to a lot of the folks in the environmental sector report in 2014, studying the kind of racial disparity within our organizations. And this report found that, which shouldn't be so surprising to a lot of us, that our nonprofits were not reflective of our communities and really did not include people of color. Only 12.4% of people of color in the nonprofit sector, a little higher with our government sector at 15.5%. And then within the foundation, again, about 12%. And not only that, she found that that when you look at leadership, right? So it's one thing to say, okay, you're gonna have a paid intern come in and be a person of color and then maybe move into a coordinator role, but what about the executive director? And what about your board of directors? And as you went up into these leadership roles, that number also continued to decline. And all right, I would say next slide. All right, so what that ultimately results in is this green ceiling. So she coined this term of a green ceiling, right? And a white insiders club of really, again, not being reflective of the community, not having programming that has included the community, and then just, kind of placing that program, those programs on communities and thinking that we're doing effective environmental work and effective environmental justice work. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and I wonder if some of you folks are in the same boat here, is that I feel like a lot of folks are kind of unlearning and also relearning the true history of our country during this time. A lot of even some of my friends being like, I didn't know what Juneteenth was, and kind of seeing the history of our country being full of racism, slavery, and having an indigenous genocide essentially. And so as we learn the true history of the country, we also need to think about the environmental movement's true history, which has primarily been, again, really violent in a lot of ways, excluding people, in particular indigenous people, from conservation spaces, creating conservation spaces just for white people. If you're not familiar with our national parks history, for example, that's a good place to start. And for me personally, until I went to graduate school, my undergrad was in environmental studies, and we learned a lot about Rachel Carson and the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, but we didn't learn about the environmental justice movement coming in concert with the civil rights movement and folks like Dr. Robert Bullard. So if you folks haven't read this, I would encourage you to. This is called Dumping in Dixie by Dr. Robert Bullard, where he's essentially studied the placement of toxic waste sites and found that in no matter what, that skin color always was the lowest common denominator in terms of where toxic waste sites were placed. So even if there was a poor white community that had, maybe bad environmental quality, that it was always going to be worse within the Black community. And that's really important history, right? That I think a lot of the time gets left out. So back to this study, Dorcetta Taylor also came up with a list of ways for the environmental sector to move forward and do a better job. And some of these seem pretty obvious, but I'll just go over them pretty quickly here with you. To have adequate and stable funding, to have committed leadership, to have organizational buy-in, to be able to communicate effectively across race, class, gender, and cultural lines, to institutionalize diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, right? To not just kind of have it be lip service, but to really create policies and have it, you know, play out in your programming, and to translate diversity training into action. And this is one of the key areas that environmental organizations and data represents, and environmental organizations get really tripped up, is that we can do a lot of talking about it and we can do a lot of diversity training, and then what does it lead to? Even mindsets might change, but that there's not actual tangible change within the organizations, and then therefore within the sector. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. All right, so again, this work is urgent because environmental organizations are currently excluding the masses. And we have some of the most urgent environmental issues that we're facing, climate change, that need to be addressed. And if we are not including our entire community, then how will we ever expect to do that? And then one really quick thing that I wanted to share with you is that Dr. Taylor did a follow-up study that was published at the end of last year, and found that it was more likely for female CEOs or female executive directors to actually reveal the diversity data within their own nonprofits and be kind of very forthcoming about either the success or lack thereof within their organizations. And that, again, it was also more likely for CEOs that were of ethnic and racial minorities to be forthcoming with that information. And some of the sharings that Dorcetta Taylor provided after that was published was that the lived experiences of women of color made them quicker to understand the urgency of this work, and how and why it could be adopted within their organizations. And so anyways, just wanted to kind of give you a snapshot of where we're at with as an environmental sector. Oh, and then one other quick thing I wanted to say related to the foundation piece of representation within grant making foundations. A wonderful resource to read is Decolonizing Wealth. If you have not read that, I would very, very much encourage you to do so. Okay.
Thank you, Rachel. That was a very helpful way to set the stage for this conversation. I think I'm probably not alone in thinking that those statistics or those findings from the study are both kind of challenging and interesting because it makes us realize how far we still have to go, but also I think really inspiring in terms of just that reminder about why these kinds of conversations are so important, and figuring out how to take these kinds of discussions and translate it into action. And I think that's always our ongoing goal, and hopefully by the next time that the next follow-up study is done, that we see even more progress. And so I want to ask our next guest, Ileana, to weigh in on this question. When you think about just your own experiences, because I know you shared with us that you have a long history both studying and working in environmental organizations, and have found some of the statistics that Rachel was sharing actually play out in real life. And so can you share with us some of your thoughts about why do you think environmental organizations aren't more diverse?
To your point, Nicole, yes, I have encountered personally difficulties with an organization who, like, for example, wanted to hire diverse candidates, was looking for a very skilled set of knowledge regarding environmental policy. And the organization really tried its best to, within its network and within professional colleagues, to find those diverse candidates. But it was really hard. And when we kind of paused and reflected on what might some of those difficulties be, a lot of it, asking your 5 whys, I think a lot of it came back to the concept of equity, in the sense that maybe one of the reasons of the whys could be that, people that had that skill set and would be interested in taking, this was for an internship, and would be interested in taking an internship with that organization, might not be able to afford to take a summer off without income, that they might need to have a commitment to their families to provide income, so that maybe re-examining the structure of an entry-level position might might help reduce that barrier. There was also maybe, just a smaller pool of candidates because there wasn't an awareness or an exposure to these types of careers at an early age. And I think that that's some of the adverse kind of inequities that we're seeing play out. But like Nicole mentioned earlier, and when she set the stage for this conversation, I'd like to take a moment too to talk about the flip side of that. I've talked to several colleagues in preparation for this conversation, and I've been hearing that the stage is changing. So the fruits of our labors are coming to bear. So for example, within Watsonville Wetlands Watch, about 80% of our staff is Spanish speaking and comes from the cultural background of the community it represents. In addition, Watsonville Wetlands Watch just launched a climate change leadership institute that pays its participants a stipend for participating in the summer program, as exposes them to different types of career opportunities within this region that are all tied to environmental stewardship, or as we call green careers. So I think this question isn't so much as like, why aren't environmental organizations more diverse, but what can we do to increase the diversity within our organizations, and what types of barriers are present in everybody's day-to-day lives that we may not be able to see. And then after that, what can we do to systemically remove and break down those barriers? Because I think the natural result of that will be an increase in diversity in these types of organization, especially if, as Rachel was mentioning earlier, that minorities really are a global majority, right? So just by sheer numbers, diversity will naturally increase without us having to maybe necessarily ask, why isn't this happening? But let's think about, I'm inviting us to think about, how can we set the stage at an earlier part in this process so that these results will happen more naturally?
Thanks so much, Ileana. And realizing too that we forgot to mention to all the participants on the call here that we're structuring this conversation using a 5 whys approach, WHY. And if any of you have used that approach before, it's a way to just, before you start jumping into solutions or trying to figure out, well, what do we do about these gaps or these barriers or disparities, to really take the time to identify or think through, well, what is the root cause? And so Ileana is leading us in the right direction here towards the solutions about, well, what do we do about this? And some of the kind of structural issues that you described, Ileana, I think are so on point in terms of, by starting with asking the question, well, why is that glass, why is that green ceiling, why does that exist? Why is it hard to, because this is a statement that, I know I've heard organizations say before, well, we tried and it's hard to find, qualified available applicants or people that want these positions. And I think your points about some of the structural pieces that need to change and that are helping change the stage currently, I think are so worth mentioning again, that, things like, offering paid stipends and just creating the opportunities for exposure to learn about the environmental field and opportunities for conservation and activism, that takes intentionality to create those structures and opportunities that then position people or create those pathways towards future employment. So thank you for sharing all those personal lessons and observations that you're seeing and hearing others share as well. So Nicole, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. So another way to think about this is why local organizations involved in mainstream environmental movement are still struggling to make progress and headway in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equity. So let's hear from Greg first, and then we'll go on to Katherine and Nancy. Greg?
Yeah,
what are
thanks.
your thoughts about this?
So a number of things stick with me when I think about how Dr. Taylor's findings, and that's a broad research of a lot of environmental organizations. And what sticks with me about how it applies to local organizations, one of the things that sticks with me is recruitment. So it's been mentioned, but we too often have informal hiring networks. I mean, most of us, I think, do the official job site postings and we check the boxes on the formal recruitment efforts, but we really lean into our informal networks. It's cheaper. I think many of us believe that's a great way to recruit. So we have our staff and our board and our partners circulate a job posting to their friends and colleagues. And if we're not a very diverse team and we do that, we're likely going to remain not a very diverse team with regard to race and other diversity as well. So I really appreciated one of the things that stays with me is Dr. Taylor challenges any group that says the candidates aren't there. I mean, I think it's true that the pipeline, early childhood education and every step along the educational way, we need to address whether people of color are represented and have opportunities. And I really appreciate that she says, you're not looking hard enough. Candidates are there. And so we were just really looking closely at how we're identifying candidates, what are our recruiting efforts, and what we're doing to look in different places. So that stays with me about recruiting. Another thing about her findings is about budgeting. So nonprofits overall, I think it bums me out, but I hear a lot of us bemoan our budget woes, and this is not just about diversity issues. We say we have a commitment to diversity, but we don't budget resources towards the effort. And it's actually true for a lot of other things. If you think about the nonprofit you're in, or maybe the ones you've been involved in, think about things like professional development and training, team building, intentionally shaping organizational culture, or employee health and wellness. Those sound like things that are luxuries. And we say they're important, but we just don't give them the budget. I was at, and I get, we have budget challenges as well. So I realize it's not as easy as just commitment, but I'm just realizing that in our budget, we make room for the things that are most important. So it kind of challenges where our commitments are. I was at a Compass Point training a couple of years ago, and the whole day was focused on budgeting. And they spent half an hour, up to an hour, talking about values. I was just exasperated. I wanted to get into Excel workbooks and see new budget templates, learn some fancy new formulas. And eventually it got through to me why they were spending so much time on this. Our budgets, my takeaway from that was that they stressed our budgets are a numeric representation of our values. At CWC, we begin our budgeting process by revisiting our organizational values. For us, that's commitment, inclusion, learning, and resilience. And we try to remember that the budget is an opportunity to show our values to ourselves and externally to demonstrate those values. So if diversity matters to us, we need to budget for the change effort. And I think too many of us don't do that. We don't give it a line item. And if we really valued it, we would budget for it. Something else Dr. Taylor talks about is culture. And this is one of the hardest ones. Let's say we're successful in hiring a person of the global majority. I appreciate that change in language, Nancy and Rachel. So let's say we hire a person of color, a person of the global majority to a mostly or to an all-white team. I wonder how many of us are really ready to welcome difference on our team. Have we examined our policies and our practices, like formal stuff, but also informal things, how we go about our work, and just how we are and what the experience might be like for the person. So we really need to examine our readiness for change. And I don't offer that as an argument not to do the work or to shirk away from it, but actually because it's hard, but just to name that it's really challenging. And I think it requires us to look at, to be willing to look at overtly, I think most of us are willing to look at overtly racist practices. I think that's true. But are we really willing to explore how white supremacy or white dominated culture, if that's part of the environmental movement, how much of that has been part of our organization's past? And maybe how much of it's still there today? And we're starting to do that. And it's going to be slow and challenging, I think. So to really uncover to see some unconscious bias and still see how it's still there for us. It's hard to see, but we won't see if we're not looking. So spending time on culture. And then one of the last things that stays with me about Dr. Taylor's work is data. And I'm struck by how many of us are willing to measure just about everything in this, in this world, but we don't have data. Too many of us don't have data on racial diversity. Some of us do, but we don't share it publicly for some of us. And I think a lot of times it's because we don't have it. I think mostly she points out and it was some of the metrics that Rachel showed at the beginning, mostly white organizations are less, white-led organizations are less likely to share their data. I think mostly white organizations have unease talking about race. I mean, should I be asking a volunteer for their race? Certainly I can't ask a donor that question, right? So we just have unease around it. And an example is within the last month, we did a board self-assessment survey and asked board members to share how they self-identify for race. And we make that type of question optional, but one response was concern about whether that was legal to ask that type of question. So I think we just are on a learning curve as far as like, how do we gather data? How do we do it appropriately? And if we don't measure that stuff, we don't have baselines. And if we don't have baselines, we can't track progress. I don't claim to have that one figured out, but we're in evolution on that. And then the last thing I think I'll share is that from what I'm sharing is the perspective from the Coastal Watershed Council, because I know our experience as the ED. But I think a lot of this applies to local environmental organizations. We're all on different paths on this, in different places on this path. And I want to point out that the other organizations we're represented on this call are more advanced in this work than the Coastal Watershed Council is. So I really appreciate and I want to highlight them as having done the work, and we're learning from everyone's failures and lessons and successes. And I'm happy to be a part of the conversation, happy to be a part of the actual work too.
Hey, thank you, Greg. And thanks for all the important reminders about budgets as value statement, culture, eating strategy for lunch, as the quote says, and the work that remains to be done. Katherine, would you like to share some of your reactions to Dr. Taylor's work and some of the other issues we've been talking about this morning? Katherine? I think you might still be on mute, Katherine.
Got it.
There you go, thanks.
All right. Well, I was, anticipating a question around why is the environmental movement considered kind of a white elitist movement? And that has often troubled me, but in sort of preparing for today's talk, and this sort of divulges a bit from Dr. Taylor's work and maybe from the question on the screen, but I did a little bit of research into the history of environmentalism, and I wrote up a little short piece, very short, it won't go over time limits, that I'd really like to share because I think it's quite revealing in terms of, why don't we get those candidates? Why is it hard? In addition to the things Greg said about, intentionality in our budgets and culture, et cetera. But if you go right back to the start of environmentalism, we've got a problem to begin with. And so this little history I wrote up starts back when, in the beginning, one of the people considered a founder of the environmental movement is Teddy Roosevelt. And he's often revered in some creating the national park system. His purpose, however, was not to protect those spaces for everyone to enjoy. Rather, he protected those lands to create playgrounds for the aristocratic explorers and hunters who wanted to get away from the teeming masses back in the cities. One of Roosevelt's contemporaries and collaborators was a fellow named Grant Madison. And Madison founded the two of the first organizations dedicated to preserving American bison and the California redwoods. But Grant is more often remembered for a book he wrote in 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race, or The Racial Basis of European History. In this book, he writes prolifically about white supremacism and the decline of the Nordic peoples. His book was later, not surprisingly, a favorite of Adolf Hitler. Another early environmentalist, Gifford Pinchot, who is one of the foremost thinkers and promoters of the conservation ethic, served on the advisory council of the American Eugenics Society in the 1920s and 30s. Even our own beloved John Muir, founder of the Sierra Club back in 1982, in a treatise he wrote about a 1,000-mile walk he made from the upper Midwest to the Gulf of Mexico, described the laziness of Sambos and lamented about the dirty and irregular life of Indians in the Merced River Valley. Muir also wrote in a collection of essays written to promote park tourism and ensure the leisure class that they were safe to visit. He said, as to Indians, most of them are dead or civilized into useless innocence. If we skip ahead a few decades and we find President Richard Nixon, who established the US Environmental Protection Agency, in setting up the EPA, he described the environment as a cause for the white majority. Getting back to the Sierra Club, now circa 1972, the organization polled its members about whether the club should concern itself with the conservation problems of such special groups as the urban poor and ethnic minorities. 40% of respondents were strongly opposed, and only 15% were supportive. 15 years later, in 1987, Fred Krupp, who was then the executive director of the Environmental Defense Fund, one of the largest environmental organizations in our country, admitted with a half-hearted mea culpa, environmental groups have done a miserable job of reaching out to minorities. And things haven't changed much. Rachel mentioned the study in 2014, Dr. Taylor's, that found whites occupied 89% of leadership positions in the environmental organizations. Well, that data is from 2014. I don't think it's changed very much in the last 6 years. If we look around even at our panel here today.
Katherine, I'm gonna interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt, but thanks for the history and the context, but I think we're gonna have to move on to our next question so that we can hear from everyone. So appreciate it. Nicole?
And this one is going to be a little bit of a, maybe a lightning round, because again, we've heard a lot about the whys, and this is kind of a combo of the last why. Why is it more important than ever to create a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable future in environmental movements? And along with that, then for our guest speakers, tell us, one highlight or an example or suggestion that you have to share, or that you would like to offer or invite everyone to be thinking about in terms of how we can all make this possible. And so we'll start with actually Nancy and Natalie. We would love to invite you to unmute yourselves and one or both of you share your thoughts about some of the discussions been happening this morning, but also give us some hope for what things might look like in the future.
Yeah, I'll start on this one. I would say that it's always been incredibly important, as people of the global majority have always been the most affected by the climate crisis and have done the least to contribute to it. But I think it's more important than ever because we're out of time, and and everything's just kind of come to a bubbling point. And I think a lot of the times there's kind of a false dichotomy of the climate crisis and racial justice issues, but we can't solve the climate crisis without dismantling white supremacy. So when you just think of how we got to the climate crisis, Hopkins had a quote about the way that we got to the climate crisis was by creating disposal, I forgot what the term is, but disposable zones, and we wouldn't have those zones without having disposable people. So really, like, systemic racism is what brought us to the climate crisis. So there's dismantling that, and then there's also that, you know, people of the global majority could have so much to add to, you know, already getting us out of this issue, but they're already so tied up in, you know, having asthma from breathing the air and being worried about not being shot down by police. So it's just incredibly important that we see these as one issue, and we can't, you know, we can't solve the climate crisis without it.
Thank you. And Nancy, did you want to add anything to that before we move on to hear from the others?
Yeah, sure. I could add a little. It's great to be here and hear this conversation. I would say it's essential now, because there isn't going to be a future if we don't figure this out. Like, eliminating racism and all forms of oppression have to be part of maintaining a livable society. And you know, it's exactly those centuries of oppression that have gotten us to the brink of destruction with climate change. If you look at the history of colonization, of stealing people, stealing resources, stealing land for the benefit of very few, that is exactly what has led us to use up the resources of the earth and, you know, get us to this level of changing the climate. And in terms of what to do, we have to recognize that everybody has been affected by the centuries of oppression, and people are at different vantage points in that. And you have to be deliberate and have specific strategies to counter the effects of institutionalized racism and other oppressions. Because if it's not deliberate, it's going to keep maintaining itself. And one specific way that this plays out in organizations is kind of hooking patterns. And many white people carry patterns because of this history of colonization, of dominance, as has been mentioned here, and of superiority, and of knowing the right thing and being smarter and having the answer. And white people will often feel comfortable speaking first and coming right in early to a meeting and taking the seat in the front row. And then the people of the global majority, because of the history of oppression, have tended to respond by deferring and feeling stupid, being told they're stupid, that they don't know, that their experience doesn't matter, that they should wait, be silent, etc. And so you have to put in strategies in your organization to counter that. And when we built Regeneración, I mean, I am a white person leading this organization, trying very hard to build an organization representative of our community that feels like it belongs to the community. And so it started with a team. We worked by inviting people in, building one-on-one relationships. So much of the problem with the environment has to do with broken connections, connection to the environment, connection to people, and connections among groups of people. And so a lot of what we have to do is rebuild connections. And those start one by one with personal relationships, and giving people a voice, encouraging people who haven't been at the center to be at the center, and to make sure that the issues are relevant. Just one more thing about the general environmental movement, again, was focused on protecting beautiful places and nature for the luxury and recreation of white people. And the environmental justice movement, which kind of grew up parallel, was not joined, and the white people in the mainstream movement weren't supporting the fights of people of the global majority to get toxins out of their communities and things like that. So there's long-standing mistrust. There's long-standing view of that people were somehow separate from the environment, and that people wanted to protect trees and polar bears, but not poor people, not brown people. And so we need to make sure people are at the center of things and help everybody connect and rebuild connections.
Thank you, Nancy and Natalie. How about Ileana? What would you like to add as a closing thought in terms of takeaways or insights from today, or a suggestion you'd like to leave people with?
Thank you, Nicole. I'd like to build a little bit off of what Nancy and Regeneración stated, that it's definitely important we keep in mind the populations that have been most adversely affected by our environmental constructs. And I think that it's more important than ever that we take steps to include the global majority, because they're the ones that need to feel empowered, supported, and strengthened enough to advocate on behalf of the protection and conservation of the resources that they have in their backyards. So for example, when I say that, I'm thinking about the wetlands that are in a predominantly Latino community. And if we want to preserve the ecosystem of the wetlands and their habitat and all the specialness that they bring with them, then we need to really make that connection with that community so that they feel that that wetland belongs to them, that they are empowered to act as its voice to protect it and conserve it. And some of the examples that I have of that include broadening our partnerships. So for example, Watsonville Wetlands Watch works very closely with the city. We're working on an initiative right now to expand our urban forest to increase more tree canopies in the city so that people can breathe healthier air and increase the carbon sequestration that's happening right in our community. In addition, we've been running Watsonville Wetland Stewards for about 15 years now to really empower youth and bring them out to the wetlands, help them understand the importance and significance of that ecosystem so that they can then advocate for it when they become adults and they can learn how special it is. And then lastly, I think, and this is an undercurrent that I've heard from various presenters, has been our framing of culture. If you think of culture as like a beautiful picture, maybe the one behind me here, you can only see what that frame is, but there's more happening beyond that picture. You know, I live in a house, there's a whole house behind me, and you don't necessarily see that unless you bother to look beyond that picture and to acknowledge that there is a broader scope, or that it lives in a broader setting. And so I guess my final and most important thought would be an invitation to help us broaden our perspective about what environmental conservation is, how it's defined, and how different people and different cultures approach it. And I think that's a good place to start for all of us. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for having me on the call. I really appreciate being able to share these thoughts with such qualified leaders in our community. Thank you for getting this conversation started for us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for being part of this conversation. And as always, we don't have as much time as we would like to be able to dive as deep into this conversation as is needed. And I'm actually going to ask our last couple guests, Greg and Katherine and Rachel, if you would be willing to share your final thoughts in the chat box, because I think we wanted to also make sure that we have some time to take maybe a couple burning questions or comments from participants or people that have been listening in on this coffee chat so far. Questions or comments about things that have been coming up for you as you've heard each of our guest speakers. So Greg, Katherine, Rachel, if you would be willing to share your final thoughts in the chat, that'd be great. And then are there any questions or comments that we should circle back to that came up in the chat box? Nicole, is there anything that we want to?
Well, I don't see questions. Thank you, Nancy, for sharing some resources. And I just want to remind everyone, we will send out a list of a number of resources we've been collecting from our speakers and others after the call. But please, if you have a specific question or even a general question for any of the guests, we can have a chance to discuss them now. And I'm feeling bad about cutting Katherine off, and she had a final comment. So maybe while we're waiting for some questions to come in, Katherine, do you want to just wrap up with the end of your statement?
Yeah, well, I was really kind of pretty much at the end of it, and I'm sorry that it went longer than I thought it did. I thought it was shorter, but you know, I think one of my last thoughts to the topic that I did some research on, and the history that I discovered was that it seems to me right now the environmental movement is sort of a really great example of people who are intentionally well-meaning and are passionate about what we do, and we think we're doing it for all the right reasons. And of course, nature is important. Without a healthy planet, we have no support system for any life. But at the same time, we're kind of a movement that is passively non-racist, but we're not yet actively anti-racist. I didn't even really know what that meant, say 2 or 3 weeks ago. And it's still something that I'm beginning to just come to grips with, like, what is the difference there? But I think that really is a good way to describe where the environmental movement is today and how much work we have to do. And, you know, in I don't know why I want to go back a century, but 2016, our board made a commitment to diversification so that we would better reflect our community. It's really hard. You know, the first thing we did was reach out and try and get some advice from, like one woman I reached out to was Marseille Guadinch, and she is the founder and executive director of ASWOL, which is maybe the only, certainly among the only environmental groups for Latinos that was founded for and serves the Latino community and brings them into especially ocean conservation. And, you know, I wanted to do that because the thing I was most afraid of was it appearing as though we were just doing tokenism, you know, that there wasn't a sincere and authentic desire to make the changes that needed to be changed. And sometimes it still feels that way for me. And we made some progress, but then, you know, board members roll off and staff come and go. You know, we had a really fabulous staff member from the Latino community who is so affected by the civil unrest happening right now. He couldn't concentrate and focus on the work that we were doing, and decided he just had to leave. He had to move on and try and find a way to work in something that was more directly engaged in the issues to fulfill himself. And that was a tremendous loss to our team. I mean, he was a wonderful person. He wasn't with us that long, but you know, I think he really had the opportunity to help us build bridges into the Latino community where we're still not very representative. We still, you know, we bring our education, I think, very successfully into the school districts, but the people are not responding. They're not participating in the same kinds of ways as we see the white people of our community. I would just end there, and sorry to be long-winded again. I guess it's
Katherine, thank
the
you.
nature of the topic.
Do we have questions, since we have our guests assembled here for a few more minutes? Any other questions for them, or examples of those of you who've done some of this work in your own organizations that want to share? So let's see, we've got a comment from Felicia. To not think about the environmental movement as starting with Teddy Roosevelt and acknowledging that Indigenous people have been environmentalists, protecting and stewarding the land since time immemorial. It's an excellent point. Thank you for that. Jessica's got a question about the kind of support our guests as leaders feel you most need to help you make the internal changes that'll move us towards systems change together. It's a big question for an ending here, but if any of our guests would like to weigh in on what makes you feel supported in this work of changing organizations and culture.
I'll offer one thing, and
Great, thanks, Greg.
I'll offer that our staff are ahead of our board of directors on this. Mm-hmm. And what's supportive for me as the ED is to remember what I do have in my control. If any organizational leaders find that maybe they're waiting on funders or board members or something to have buy-in on this, it's been helpful for me to realize what I do have control over. So a reminder of the role of, we're not all EDs, but the executive director role, or for any of us, you know, managing up and leading, even when we're not at the very top of some org chart or something. That's been helpful for me to remember, and to remind others, like, this is my decision, this is our decision, we get to do this without asking for permission. Mm-hmm. And I realize my privilege lets me have voice in that, but it's been helpful for me to remember the role thing.
Great reminder, thanks. Rachel, I wonder if you have anything to add on that too. I know you've had some of those struggles with boards and others.
Yeah, I would say thank you. For me, I would just love for people to keep holding us accountable. I mean, kind of like, again, going back to Dorcetta Taylor's study, the women and people of color in leadership positions kind of know what this looks like in some ways. And, you know, if, for example, we put out a statement about racial equity and Black Lives Matter, and I want people to follow up and say, what does your board look like? And then they'll see what my board looks like. And that's been a challenge for us. And what are you actually doing? Because if people aren't going to question us, especially from all of our donors and within this community, then leadership kind of gets to just keep saying like, oh, look, we did this diversity training, we're great, you know, or we serve this community of color and we get to feel like white saviors, but nobody's really pushing us on it. So push us, you know, send us a letter, send my board of directors a letter. I would love to share it with them. That'd be so helpful.
Okay, thanks for that invitation, Rachel. And I think it's fitting that we started with Dr. Taylor and are ending with Dr. Taylor as well. This conversation is, like so many of the core coffee chats we have, way more topics and depth to go into than we have time for. So I'm sorry that we can't keep going, but we will kind of keep going with future conversations, and we hope this stimulates conversations and action of your own. So just to let you know what's coming up next, and a reminder to fill out our feedback survey. This is how we keep trying to improve these chats and respond to the questions that you may have or topics that you're most interested in. But next up, we have a similar conversation about supporting older adults, and particularly the issue of isolation during COVID-19. We also have an introduction to a specific tool of the community resilience model. Well, that'll be in a workshop format with some practice built in, so it'll be a little longer. So just for your information, it'll be till 11:15 instead of jumping off at 11. We have something in the works for the 14th that we haven't confirmed yet, but we'll let you know. And then on the 21st, we're going to start delving into health and all policies in a series that will be co-hosted with the City of Santa Cruz. So thank you all for being here today. Special thank you to all of our guests, Ileana, Katherine, Rachel, Greg, Nancy, and Natalie. So appreciate the prep time that was behind this, as well as your participation today. I know you've inspired us to think differently about a lot of these issues, and we hope that ripple will go out across the organizations on this call and beyond. So thank you all. Thanks everyone for being here, and we look forward to seeing you same time, same channel. And we'll send out the resources in a follow-up email, as well as a link to the webinar version of this, the taped version, so you can share it with colleagues if you weren't able to attend in person. Thanks a lot. See you soon. Take care.